We've got a crossover or squadcast episode of Locked on Kraken because we have not one, but two mutuals with our friend Armando Velez, who's going to talk all things Florida Panthers coming up on today's episode of Locked on Kraken.
You're Locked on Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, hockey fans? Erica L. Ayala here, your host of Locked on Kraken, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. And I'm sitting here with the guy that got to watch it all, the last game of the hockey season, and celebrate alongside his team, Locked on Florida Panthers host Armando Velez. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Great to be with you, my Locked on Hermana here on the network as two Latinos covering hockey here. And yeah, it feels great to be covering a Stanley Cup champion, but it's also crazy at the same time, the amount of turnaround that has happened between winning the championship and all the moves in between. So we're going to get back to really celebrating the Stanley Cup championship after development camp for sure. But it's been a lot in the last just few months, and just to cover another extended playoff run for the Panthers, it's been such a joy to do that for the Panthers, and doing this in year 30. It's crazy because making the Cup final in year 3 after being coming into the league along with the Anaheim Ducks. I mean, you think that they stapled themselves in the market then, but then some down years with them, only 2 playoff appearances after that, a 12-year playoff drought, and then really in the last 4 seasons, the Panthers knocking on the door with being second in the Central Division in 2021, President's Trophy, 2 Stanley Cup final appearances, and then finally stamping and becoming Stanley Cup champions for the first time in 30 years.
It's an amazing ride. It's something that the Seattle Kraken are trying to figure out what their timeline is going to look like. But we know a lot of hard work goes into it, and from your perspective as well. So we're going to talk how you've been handling everything a little bit later in the show. But we had the open on the Locked on Kraken side of things. And when we connected, there was only one mutual, but now we have 2 in Brandon Montour and Mahura also coming over in free agency. It was quite a splash on the Seattle Kraken side of things, especially knowing that historically Ron Francis, our general manager, had not given out long-term deals. And so we figured who better to tell us about not one, but again, 2 of the new players that we have than you, Armando. Now with Brandon, we're getting a defenseman, and it's something that I've been saying for a while that the Seattle Kraken needed. And I was looking at some time on ice data, not just for the playoffs, but even for the regular season. And it seemed like Montour was doing a lot for Florida. So you are the expert in all things Florida Panthers. So let us know, what was Brandon like on the Florida Panthers? What do you expect from him day in, day out?
He is the loudest guy in the room, first of all. He is the guy who's always going to mess with you, roast you. He'll even mess with some of the writers. I won't name the writer that he mostly messed with during outside of locker room scrums for the Panthers and their media. But for Brandon Montour, logging a lot of minutes for him, with being not only on the second pair for him, being part of the penalty kill, being part of the quarterbacking the power play for the Panthers too. So that's going to take a lot of minutes for him. And really, it's really been for the last 2 seasons where he's really exploded, and learning under the Palmery system. It's really one that he's thrived in for him. Originally got traded to the Florida Panthers in the 2021 trade deadline. Really for them, traded a 3rd round pick to the Buffalo Sabres at the time too, but really hadn't exploded offensively. A former 2nd round pick. It's crazy also to see the different teams around the NHL who have had guys who have eventually turned into stars for them in different places. I mean, look at the Anaheim Ducks, Montour, Shea Theodore, who is part of the Vegas Golden Knights, Hampus Lindholm, who is now part of the Bruins, Josh Manson, who won a Stanley Cup with the Colorado Avalanche, even Marcus Pettersson is part of a regular in Pittsburgh. And then Buffalo with Evan Rodriguez, Sam Reinhart, Kulikov, Montour, Okposo winning it with the Panthers, and even Jack Eichel and Ryan O'Reilly winning it elsewhere too. So different. Think about what the Florida Panthers have done, and even other teams who have done with guys who haven't been able to develop into a Stanley Cup champion elsewhere, and then doing so with other teams too. So that's another thing. And really for the Kraken, they're hoping that they get to reap some of that benefits of someone who has been through multiple playoff runs for him, who has developed his game more, and now can mentor some of the young guys in Seattle. Because for Seattle, I mean, only in year 4 of their franchise now. They've developed the farm. They've got a lot of draft capital that they've been using. They haven't really been too much of big game hunting. Have developed the Coachella Valley now with 2 straight trips to the Calder Cup final too, even though they lost both of them, but still getting there too, and also bringing their coach along the way too, and Dan Balma, which is big.
Coaches.
Jessica Campbell being the first woman behind a bench too. And, maybe it's that next step, as there's salary cap space, there's draft picks too for Seattle. So maybe this is a good situation for Seattle coming up in the future, even though I'm not the biggest fan of the Stevenson contract, but it could work well in the beginning. I see that more like the Vincent Trocheck contract with the Rangers last offseason. So maybe a little bit of a comparable of what it could work at first for Seattle.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And we're going to be breaking down a lot of these contracts because I've been like begging for Seattle to do something in the last 2 off seasons. And then I was like, wow, we come right out the gate, which is amazing. You mentioned Disco Dan Bilesma. He's our new head coach and has been, as you mentioned, the Florida Panthers having development camp, dev camp all throughout the NHL, including, of course, the Seattle Kraken. So we got our first look at Dan Bilesma, and he named, as I mentioned, Jessica Campbell to his staff, as well as Bob Woods, who he crossed paths with in Buffalo when he was with the Sabres. So I think there are a few things. I want to stick with Montour for a little bit here, and then we can also talk about Josh. But for me, there were 2 things that stood out in learning a little bit about Brandon Montour, but then also hearing his media availability, with Seattle Kraken media. And the first thing is that Dan Bilesma and his staff, they want a fast team. They want a team that can skate. And it sounds like Montour can fit into that mold.
That man can fly on the ice. Like it's crazy to think, because you don't even, it's crazy to think that also, like, for him, how quick he can go from south to north too. When hitting the brakes and also getting back in transition, and also that first pass out on a stretch too for Monty. And that's the thing with how he's developed his game too for him. And also, even though he had a few turnovers in the Stanley Cup final towards the end, and he was taken off of power play 1, for him, he's still fast enough to get back and also to prevent a scoring chance, hopefully for the opposition. So that's what I'm hoping for Brandon Montour, as he levels it down on the turnovers in the offensive zone, especially on the power play, because that was a real that really was a big head scratcher for the Florida Panthers, especially in the Stanley Cup final. Still crazy to think how they won the Stanley Cup with only 1 power play goal in the series too, and that came on their second unit for the Panthers. But for also not only him, but Josh Mahura, even though he was a healthy scratch a good majority of the season and even into the playoffs, the year before, Mahura was a waiver claim for the Florida Panthers from the Anaheim Ducks. Here we go, mentioning the Anaheim Ducks again. And he played every single regular season game and the postseason for the Panthers before losing to the Vegas Golden Knights. So although Mahura is not going to take a big role for the Kraken, I don't anticipate that. There's still that experience there of a guy who can give you like 11 to 12 minutes a night there if you need to fill him in for a 7th defenseman. But Montour, going back to him, he can fly. Yeah, he can shoot the puck from the point, and he can get that cross zone feed to the guy up front too. So that's another thing about just Montour's hockey IQ for him.
Yeah, you mentioned Josh Mahura. It's a 1-year, one-way, 775 AAV contract. Josh is a veteran defenseman who adds depth and experience to our blue line, said Seattle Kraken General Manager Ron Francis in our press release. He will be a welcome addition to our group as we look forward to next season. Totaled 9 points, all assists in 30 games with the Panthers in 23-24. Led Florida defensemen who played 50 or fewer games. 6 feet, 193, I guess. And, 21 career Stanley Cup playoff games. And that experience, and to your point, maybe even about the Stevenson deal and some of the veterans that we continually bring in, that seems to be what the Seattle Kraken like to do. But I think it's also interesting because, again, not just Dan Biles, but more so specifically Jessica Campbell in a lot of estimations, including in Biles' own. This is going to be all about player development. And I think that's really interesting because Jessica Campbell, as an independent or, kind of running her own business, I should say, outside of the NHL prior to coming in with the AHL, was known as a skills development coach, particularly on the skating side. And while she's going to get some support and assist Bob Woods on the power play, which is what she ran in Coachella Valley, this is going to be an opportunity for her really to put her stamp on Seattle Kraken hockey. And everyone in the press release of the new head coaches, including Dan Bosma and Ron Francis, wanted to make sure that the Seattle Kraken put their thought process out there regarding the NHL. And they were like, we don't understand why the NHL isn't still considered a development league. And I like that because, of course, you want NHL ready players, and there's something to that. But the way that, as the saying goes, you stay ready so you ain't got to get ready, right? And the way you stay ready in the NHL is by always leveling up your game, because we see young players, we see the game evolve over time, and you have to be able to keep up with that. And so it was really encouraging to hear that from Seattle. But again, we have to see how it's all going to come together. So I'll probably ask you a few more questions about Montour and Mahura, but of course, I want to hear all about your personal experience covering the Stanley Cup finals and seeing the team that you cover win it all. I got a little taste of what it's like to party in Florida hockey circles during All-Stars, so I can only imagine, Armando, what the stories are going to be. We'll talk about that and so much more coming up. Today's episode of Locked on Kraken and Locked on Florida Panthers, brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. That's the formula for winning a championship. And again, Armando's going to tell us all about that. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. We're talking superchargers, roof racks, even LED lights and exhaust kits. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with that eBay Guaranteed Fit, you will find a part that is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. And the Guaranteed Fit is only for U.S. customers. Welcome back to another episode of Locked on Kraken, also partnering with Armando Velez, your host of Locked on Florida Panthers. This is, yes, a squadcast, as I like to say, or a crossover. We have some mutuals. We talked a little bit about Montour and Mahura, but now this is your chance. Let us know. You know what it's like to be an expansion team. We're just learning what it's like to be an expansion team. But of course, you have now reached the pinnacle of where the Seattle Kraken are trying to be. I, for one, want to know what your experience was like, so I don't act like the new kid on the block when the Seattle Kraken make a deeper run in the playoffs.
Well, for me personally, it was crazy because once they won Game 3 of the Stanley Cup final, and for those who don't know, I no longer reside in South Florida, 4 hours north of the territory. So once they won Game 3, I said, I'm traveling to South Florida. to be with the fan base and to hopefully experience a Stanley Cup run. But for the Panthers, they lost the last of the next three. And, hockey players are superstitious, and a lot of their fans too are superstitious too, just like myself. So for me, for game 7, I said, I have to leave. I have to watch this game by myself. I declined every single invitation to watch the game with anyone. So I had to, because had they lost, I wouldn't have wanted anyone to see my reaction had they blown it. But thankfully it worked out in the end for the Florida Panthers. And yeah, just like All-Star, they had their championship celebration in the same location that All-Star was at in Fort Lauderdale Beach near Las Olas. So also where Odyssey Beach Festival is held too. So great location as they went right down A1A for the parade, and just no amount of rain was going to cancel that parade. And the amount of F-bombs that Paul Maurice threw, the cats on the back of on the front and back of his shirt with both logos there too. And just for the Panthers, and just setting themselves up for this championship too. I mean, for the difficult decisions of trading Jonathan Huberdeau for Matthew Tkachuk, that big blockbuster, adding Mackenzie Weegar in the first round pick. And then even before, some trades that didn't work out for them in 2022 with Ben Sherratt and Claude Giroux only getting 20 some odd games in them, including the postseason, and then just being eliminated and swept in round 2. That sweep was the best thing to ever happen for the Florida Panthers, weirdly, for them, and just how they were able to recover from it, and just to get to this point, which the Florida Panthers, it's crazy to think with them and this cycle, this window, they took advantage of the window. That's the thing for them is taking advantage, because they knew that they were going to lose guys. They lost not only on top of Montour, they lost Kevin Stenlund, Ryan Lomberg too. They already lost Vladimir Tarasenko. They were never going to be able to pay him too. There's just so many losses for them to win or lose. That they were gonna lose these guys too. And it's crazy. Also, going back to another thing, which we can relate the Kraken and the Panthers with, is the fact that they bought out Keith Yandel's contract right before the expansion draft in order to protect Gustav Forsling in their protection list for the expansion draft. Obviously ended up being Chris Driedger as their pick, which was also a free agent signing, which, crazy enough, Chris Driedger is back with the Panthers as their third goaltender, what it looks to be their third goaltender, in my opinion. But it's crazy to think about how it's gone full circle with putting Gustav Forsling in there in that protection list, and then putting Anthony Duclair at the time too, and also for the Panthers, and thinking, okay, you lose Chris Driedger, that's the best thing that's going to happen, because you still have Spencer Knight in your system. You protected Forsling there too. So for the Panthers, it's all the different various moves of leading up to it. It's not necessarily one, although the Matthew Tkachuk one is the one that sticks out the most, but it's a little bit over time. And it really, for the Panthers, their first move was bringing in Patrick Hornquist to the mix in the offseason of 2020, which, funny enough, not funny, but crazy enough, that his last game was against the Seattle Kraken back on last year in the 2022-23 season, right before his career unfortunately ended due to his head injuries too. So it was incremental steps to eventually become a Stanley Cup champion.
Yeah, what I heard you from what I heard you saying, I kept thinking of the term like compounding, right? You just compounding interest. And I'm hopeful that some of what we're seeing this season will be that. And to your point about the expansion draft, it seems to me, not just with the naming and appointment of a new head coach, as we mentioned, Dan Bilesma taking over for Dave Haxtell, I think also, Chris Driedger, it was tough. I think he had a tough go here, just the circumstances. It would seem like a series of unfortunate events. And then he was really the anchor for the Firebirds, as you mentioned earlier, as they made their second appearance in the Calder Cup finals and only their second season. However, it just, I think there were a few things that broke down defensively. The Firebirds just weren't as great in front of Driedger, but I also think it's true, and we talked about this on Locked on Kraken. There were just, some ones that, if I had to guess, Driedger would probably want back. But there's something that you mentioned regarding the celebration, and particularly you mentioned Paul Maurice. And I think for me, especially because I've been able to go to Florida and cover Panthers games. I'll be in South Florida again this August for the Amerigo Latam Cup. So I'm excited for that. And I'll be at the Panthers practice facility, which is right behind you, Armando. I love that. But he was pretty open about what it would mean for him in particular. And another connection to the Florida Panthers and Locked On, or the Seattle Kraken and Locked On Kraken, here we covered the ECHL playoffs because our Kansas City Mavericks were in there. And who did they lose to? Kind of a dynasty of a team they got there in the Everblades. And so Paul Maurice was joking, how he has a family member with more rings than he does, because it's his son, right? That does he's play-by-play. For the Everblades. And you could just tell, I mean, obviously he was joking. He's very happy for his son. And he really wanted to win, Armando.
Yeah. Paul Maurice said, I've been doing this almost 30 years. I'd like to win one, but deep down inside, he's like craving for it. And even as he was climbing up the coaching list and seeing all the wins that he had, when you compare it to Scotty Bowman, Barry Trotz, Joel Quenneville, and when you think about, he's just like, I need to win a cup in order for me to solidify. So he understands the assignment for him. And although the Florida Everblades are no longer the Panthers affiliate after this season, and now it's the Savannah Ghost Pirates, crazy to think that how much success Florida hockey in general has had these last few years with Tampa's dynasty, and then the Florida Everblades getting three championships in a row, one of them being under the Nashville affiliation too. But I was at Game 4 of the Kelly Cup final, where I actually got to interview Jake Maurice there. Which, if you guys haven't followed me on Twitter, it's my pinned tweet on my profile. If you want to check out that interview between Jake Maurice and I, just about the journey of broadcasting too. Also, Paul Maurice understands the life of media members too, knowing that if it was his son on the other side, of how to answer people too. Paul Maurice just overall just knows how. Just is a people person. He knows and I think that's really what the Panthers were really looking for too when bringing in a new head coach. I mean, Andrew Burnett got a little bit of experience under his belt, but saw when the lights were the brightest that it was choked up under pressure, and some of the answers that he was giving to the outside too was just a little bit head scratching. While Paul Maurice, he'll tell you what's on his mind, but also not tell you what's on his mind too. It's a little bit of a good mix of not knowing, of knowing kind of the PR game too. So that's what Paul Maurice is really good at as well.
Yeah, he was a real delight in just the brief encounters that I had with him going to some Florida Panthers games. But I want to talk a little bit about what Paul Maurice and company will have to do if they want a chance to get back, not just to another Stanley Cup final, which would be huge for them, but also, of course, to be able to repeat as champions. I'm going to get your thoughts on that. And then we'll also talk about what Seattle is going to do. Got some new names, some fresh blood in the coaching ranks. But what is it all going to look like when it goes from paper to the ice sheet? We'll talk about that coming up. And thanks as always for making Locked On a part of your daily destination, whether you're listening to the Stanley Cup Champions podcast, Locked On Florida Panthers, or you're listening to the newest expansion team podcast, Locked On Kraken. We appreciate you. Make sure you stay locked on the Florida Panthers and the Seattle Kraken through the Locked On Kraken NHL podcast network. We bring you your favorite team every single weekday. All right, Armando. Free agency. You talked about a lot of the exits, a lot of the moves that the Florida Panthers have made. But as you sit here now, in this first week of July, what do you think are the needs? Do you feel good about where the team is at? What is still on the horizon, do you think, this offseason?
For the Panthers, it was really about taking care of the guys who got you a win in the Stanley Cup. And really, that's really what if you let a whole bunch of guys walk away after winning a cup, I mean, it's about, you think about why do you do this for? Why do you do this in the first place if you're going to let a whole bunch of your guys walk too? and also for the Panthers, especially the big one that just happened recently, and Anton Lundell getting extended. It was a higher cap hit than I anticipated, but the term is so great. Where I thought he was going to get a 3-year deal, but it goes to a 6-year deal, $5 million AAV. So right now the Panthers have less than $1 million in cap space. So right now, with the Panthers already trading a whole bunch of first-round picks in the most recent years, the Panthers are going to be a little patient these next few years, as that things will be resetting in the next few, with Ekblad's contract coming up in 2025, Bob's contract in 2026. So right now the Panthers are just laying it low for a little bit and seeing what they have until the trade deadline too. As like I mentioned earlier, the depth pieces for them walked away, like Montour, Vladimir Tarasenko, too, for the Panthers, Kevin Stenlund, but also replacing them with guys who are trying to prove it, in Nate Schmidt on the defense core, who could possibly run a power play. Thomas Nosek, who's probably going to be your forward, who's going to be on the PK, who also brings his own fair share of playoff experience too. So a lot of prove it guys who want to be a part of a Stanley Cup winning culture. So you're going to have a little bit of both, guys who are going to get paid and guys who are going to want to prove themselves too. And also for the Panthers, I mentioned the expansion draft with putting Gustav Forsling on that list. It's crazy. I just pulled up the list. Crazy to think. And I'm just like scratching my head a little bit looking at the list now from a few years ago. It was Huberdeau, Barkov, Bennett, Verhaeghe, Patrick Hornquist, Mason Marchment, and Anthony Duclair, while the defense was Ekblad, Weegar, and Forsling, with Bobrovsky a part of that. But for the Kraken, going back to them, seeing about what their free agent needs are, nobody's making over $8 million too. They have $11 million currently in cap space from what I'm seeing. So maybe it seems for the Kraken to flip it over back to their side of things. Looks like they could be big game hunting come trade deadline if they're better than what they're anticipated to be, because even a few years ago they had a whole bunch of depth scoring, but not that number one guy. That's what we're hoping that Matty Beniers becomes. A few years of seasoning for Shane Wright in the Coachella Valley. Maybe that's the type of contracts that they work on the cheap right before they get their payday, and then maybe to solidify some guys from the outside to go big game hunting for them. And so maybe that's the hope for Seattle. But on the Florida Panthers side of things are not only resetting contract wise, but Keith Yandle's contract. The majority of that buyout was 2 years ago on the 2022 season. The whole thing is coming off the books come next offseason, which is, it's only $1.2 million, but that's a cheap contract on your books that you could put for the Panthers to replenish the depth on their roster.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot there, including that, again, the Seattle Kraken find themselves in a position where they do have some cap space to play with. I love what you're saying, not just about maybe being active around the deadline, but also the fact that it might be, time to really get a true scorer. I talk on Locked on Kraken a lot about, we kind of put all our eggs in the Burakovsky basket, and, he's definitely can be a scorer. We saw what he can do at World Championships, with his home country. And I think, though, what we're seeing is that there's maybe some overcorrecting, maybe him trying to play hero hockey at times. But how much of that is because, to your point, we've been able to get a lot of depth scoring. The most successful season that we had, it was our fourth line that would really activate a lot of our offense, and then everyone would kind of follow suit. So when you have a player that can score, but maybe not playmakers that are necessarily vibing with his game, how much is that an issue? I think also thinking of Beniers and Tolvanen and what we're going to see, now that we have to figure out some contract stuff with them. I like that the Kraken seem to be, wanting to work out a deal. What that's going to look like, though, it's gonna, to be seen. But I like what Tolvi brings. We got him basically for free off of waivers from, you mentioned Nashville earlier. They have had a very interesting free agency period. But I think the Seattle Kraken are ready to make the next the next moves. They're ready to level up. And what I like is that I think we're being a little less cautious. And my estimation is that when you have, again, not one, but two coaches that have come from your AHL affiliate and are now coming to your NHL club, you can accelerate that learning curve a little bit with a new head coach, even in an organization that's really new, because the expectation is that Dan Bilesma, Jessica Campbell, who've been running development camps, who've been at training camp the last 2 seasons, can be able to fall in lockstep with what Maddie Beniers needs to do, or what, as you mentioned, Shane Wright needs to do. Ty Cartier and his ability to play 77 games in the NHL, very much credited to Jessica Campbell and the work that she does on the player development side. And so how much more can we get out of him this season? Can Riker Evans make that jump? You mentioned having 7D right now for the Seattle Kraken. Where does Riker, can he fight for a spot, a la what we saw Joey Daccord do, where he was able to win out a spot against the aforementioned Chris Driedger? These are all questions that we have. But for me, I like the momentum. I like where we're heading. And I really like that even early in the free agency period, the questions that I had regarding front office and maybe some of the things that former head coach Dave Haxtell kind of absorbed as part of his legacy, that in my estimation were maybe more front office issues. It seems like the front office has woken up a little bit as well, and Ron Francis and the rest of his staff are willing to make some of these moves, but also still make smart moves, which is very much the Kraken hockey style of and how to operate hockey business.
Yeah, and you think about for Seattle with and you mentioned Joey Daccord. I'm also thinking about Philip Grubauer in this situation where they signed as a Vezina finalist from a few years ago, not necessarily living up to the deal. And I'm actually looked up the buyout calculator for Philip Grubauer towards the end of the 2025 season. It's actually a not expensive buyout for him too, if they truly think that Joey Daccord is the guy after this year.
Right.
So they'd be saving a lot of money to also create something big too if they're not looking at another goalie outside, because they still have a pretty decent commitment to Philip Grubauer there too for them as Joey Daccord. I mean, I even saw a little bit of Joey Daccord when the Panthers and the Kraken shared an affiliate in Charlotte just a few years ago too.
That's
so
right.
It's a little bit of that for the two. So maybe Joey Daccord is the guy who's going to be the starter on the cheap too. That's another thing. So that's another thing about using guys who are doubted maybe for them, and also play up to above their level of their contracts too. So that's another thing that I'm going to be looking out for for the Seattle Kraken, is their goaltending situation.
Oh yeah, you and me both. And it does seem like the writing's on the wall that we're likely going to stick with Philip Grubauer for this season. But as you said, and we've talked about this on Locked On Kraken, the buyout options, even beyond this year, they're reasonable. And if it is, I think if I had to guess, I think the Kraken want to see if Joey is the real deal. And I think he proved a lot. He had to step up to the plate as Philip Grubauer got injured. And then we saw that he got drained towards the end of the season. Now, in my estimation, I've said this about a lot of goalies for the Kraken in our short history. I really just think we overworked Joey a little bit. And that is not just because I'm not just talking about starts, right? Because I would argue a lot of goalies want as many starts as they can get. And especially someone like Joey Daccord trying to prove something. But I'm talking about overworking him in the shots faced per game. And a lot of people will say, if you look at advanced analytics for the Seattle Kraken, we're top 6 or somewhere in that top 10 for sure in a lot of advanced metrics for defense. However, I always like to employ the eye test when it comes to defense, because if you are doing better than predicted, the predicted number is just that. It's a fabricated number that someone, typed into a calculator or a computer somewhere, but it doesn't tell you how a team or an opponent necessarily is really facing up in that game. And that's where an eye test told me that we were putting a lot on our goalies, and the lion's share of that was on Joey Daccord. And I just think he really got burnt out, especially because he had a deep run where he was also relied on in the AHL. So many of those series went the distance, lots of overtime games, and he admitted it. Hockey is a quick off season when you're winning. It's super short, and that's what you want, but it's also taxing. And so I'm very curious to see how Joey's going to bounce back. And I think to your point about whether it's coming in at the trade deadline or even looking at that Grubauer contract, my gut is telling me that the Seattle Kraken, likely for the first time, will be serious about looking at all of those things and shoring up goaltending, even if it means having to do that at the latter half of this upcoming season.
Yeah, and just looking at the Kraken's Corsi numbers, they're over 50%, 51% in Corsi, but actual shots for on them, they're under 50. So you see that the overworking of goaltenders, the lack of block shots on their end, it's resulting in that for, which ends up overworking the goaltenders. And that's hopefully for the Seattle Kraken as they made these signings, one of them being Brandon Montour, who can shot block. That's what hopefully for the Kraken is, that it's less and less pressure on those goaltenders, so that they're not, because you have to think about different areas of the body, the groin, too, especially on those low shots, that even if they're not hitting the net, you're still putting a lot of energy into trying to at least save or even get a tip on those shots.
Indeed. Well, Armando, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Congratulations to you. Congratulations to you also, just as a podcaster, as a journalist, as a reporter, for being able to follow this team. I mean, we were keeping up with you on Locked on Kraken. Saw that you had Bucci on the show. That was amazing. I mean, and the content, great as always. So if you're not already, make sure you're following Locked on Florida Panthers. And of course, you can follow Armando Velez as well at MondoMan12. That's 12. All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this crossover episode. As for Locked on Kraken, you can find us everywhere you find Locked on Florida Panthers, on YouTube, on your favorite audio platform, and of course on social media. And as for me, you can find me and with a little bit of help from Seth Tupel these days, but we're managing the Locked on Kraken YouTube account and social media accounts. And you can follow me personally at Erica_L_Ayala if you like women's basketball or you like reading stuff on CBS Sports. But for Armando, again, my name is Erica L. Ayala. We'll close out the show like we always do on Locked on Kraken. Be kind to yourselves. Be kind to one another. And hey, hold fast. Stay true, Kraken fans. And for hockey fans, I hope you enjoy your off season and that your team doesn't give you too many fits. But we'll be ready when the puck drops in the fall. Take care, everybody.